Hello, my name is Miguel Reyes. I'm 35 years old, and I'm the newly elected senator for the great state of Texas. But don't rush to assume that I was born into this seat of power, or that I grew up basking in the glow of political privilege. No, my path to this point was anything but paved with roses. It was filled with scars, sleepless nights, and arguments that felt like they were tearing my heart apart. If you ask me what brought me to where I am today, I'd say it's faith. Faith in a cleaner world, a better future, and perhaps faith that I could stand firm against my own family. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in my modest D.C. apartment, slipped under a stack of policy briefs and constituent letters. The envelope was cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering that screamed wealth and tradition. Mrs. Lucía Reyes requests the honor of your presence. I could barely finish reading before my hands started trembling. After 17 years of silence, my mother was inviting me to her 60th birthday gala at the Reyes mansion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I grew up in Austin, Texas, in a sprawling estate that overlooked Lady Bird Lake. From the outside, the Reyes family home looked like a palace. White limestone columns, towering windows, and a meticulously tended garden bursting with vibrant bluebonnets. But inside, it was as cold as a January morning in the hill country. That was where I learned that money and power never equate to happiness. My family was a dynasty, a name known throughout Texas, Reyes Oil Corporation. We owned refineries, pipelines, and drilling operations across the state. The black gold that flowed through our veins had built empires, but behind the staggering profit margins were communities living in fear for their health, children with asthma rates 3 times the national average, and rivers that ran black with chemicals. I realized this at a very young age, but my father, Carlos Reyes, did not. To him, the environment was merely an obstacle, something to be swept aside to keep the money flowing into the vault. "Profit is everything, Miguel," he would say, holding a glass of bourbon, his eyes fixed on me, as if I were a failed project. "If you want to succeed, learn to put profit above emotions." That was the last conversation we had before I left home at 18. Before I chose environmental science over business school. Before I chose my conscience over my inheritance. Now, staring at this invitation, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Miguel Reyes, Senate victory, officially certified. The irony wasn't lost on me. The son they'd written off as a tree-hugging dreamer had just won the most powerful political seat in their state. "Are you going to go?" Nathan Patel, my campaign manager and closest friend, asked from across the room. His sharp eyes studied me with the same intensity he'd used to dissect polling data during the campaign. I looked back at the invitation, then at the news notification on my phone. Maybe it was time to face the family that had forgotten I existed. Maybe it was time to stand in my truth, not as the disappointing son, but as Senator Miguel Reyes. I was 12 when I first understood what my family's wealth truly cost. It was a sweltering August afternoon in East Austin, and I had convinced our housekeeper, Rosa, to take me with her to visit her sister's family in the neighborhood near one of our refineries. The moment we stepped out of our air-conditioned car, the acrid smell of chemicals hit me like a slap across the face. "Mijo, cover your nose," Rosa whispered, pulling a handkerchief from her purse. But I didn't want to cover my nose. I wanted to understand why the air tasted like metal, and why the children playing in the small park were coughing. That's when I met Maria Santos, Tati and Gabe's mother. She was hanging laundry on a line behind a small duplex, her movements quick and efficient, despite the oppressive heat. When she saw me staring at the dark plume rising from the refinery smokestacks, she walked over with a sad smile. "You're one of the Reyes boys, aren't you?" she asked gently. I nodded, suddenly ashamed of my clean clothes and healthy lungs. "My son Gabe, he's your age. He can't play outside when the wind blows from the east because it makes his breathing worse." I looked around at the neighborhood, at the peeling paint on houses, at the brownish tint in the water flowing from a broken fire hydrant, at the children who seemed smaller and more tired than my classmates at the private academy I attended. This was what my father's empire was built on. This was the progress he spoke about so proudly at dinner. When I returned home that evening, I found my father in his study, surrounded by maps and geological surveys. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I went to the neighborhood near the East Austin refinery today." He looked up from his papers with mild interest. "Oh? And what did you think of our operation? Why are the children there sick? Why does the air smell like that?" My father chuckled, the sound echoing off the mahogany walls lined with awards and photographs of him shaking hands with politicians. "Miguel, that's the price of progress. You'll understand when you're older." But I didn't understand, and I didn't want to. From that day forward, I started paying closer attention. I read about rivers poisoned by industrial waste, about forests cleared for drilling sites, about communities like Maria's, where childhood asthma rates were through the roof. Every time I tried to discuss it with my father, he dismissed me with the same refrain: "You're too sensitive, Miguel. The world doesn't run on emotions." The breaking point came during my senior year of high school. I had been accepted to the University of Texas with a scholarship to study environmental policy, but my father had other plans. "You'll go to business school," he announced over dinner, cutting into his steak with precise movements. "Harvard, like I did. You were born to carry on this company's legacy." My mother, Lucía, sat silently at the other end of the table, her hands gripping her napkin tightly. She was beautiful in that fragile way that reminded me of pressed flowers, delicate, preserved, but somehow lifeless. She had been a teacher once before she married my father, but now she spent her days organizing charity luncheons and pretending not to notice the cracks in our family's foundation. "But I don't want that," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I want to study environmental science. I want to help communities like the ones our refineries are poisoning." My older brother Javier, 4 years my senior, laughed from across the table. "Listen to him, Dad. Our little environmentalist thinks he's going to save the world by hugging trees." "That's enough," my father said, but his disappointment was clear. "Miguel, you're betraying this family. If you choose this path, don't expect a cent from me." I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the marble floor. "I don't need your money," I replied, knowing full well I was setting myself on a treacherous path. "I'll manage on my own." Quote. That night I packed a single suitcase and left the only home I'd ever known, carrying nothing but a scholarship, a few $100s in savings, and a dream bigger than the Texas sky. Leaving the Reyes mansion felt like stepping out of a gilded prison. No more suffocating dinners under my father's disappointed gaze, no more of Javier's razor-sharp taunts. But freedom always comes with a price. On my first day at the University of Texas, I stood in front of the ivy-covered limestone dormitory, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Austin buzzed with energy that the sterile halls of my childhood home had never possessed. But I quickly realized that without my father's money, college life was anything but easy. Tuition, textbooks, rent, all of them weighed on my shoulders like boulders. I applied for additional scholarships, but they only covered a fraction of the costs, so I started working, taking any job I could find. My first job was waiting tables at a cozy little cafe near campus called the Armadillo. The place smelled of freshly ground coffee and breakfast tacos, and its walls were adorned with murals of Texas wildflowers. I worked from early morning to late afternoon, my feet aching, but the customers' smiles and their stories of hill country adventures made it worthwhile. I also took on a part-time job as a research assistant for Dr. Elena Vasquez, a passionate environmental scientist who specialized in water pollution. She was a petite woman with graying hair, always tied back in a practical bun, but her dedication to protecting Texas ecosystems was boundless. "Miguel, the environment isn't something we own," she told me during our first meeting in her cluttered office. "It's something we borrow from future generations." I worked in her lab analyzing water samples from rivers near industrial sites, and each result hit me like a punch to the gut. Toxic chemical levels off the charts, mass fish die-offs, soil contaminated with heavy metals. Those numbers weren't just data. They were nature's cries for help, and I was determined to listen. It was during a student-led protest outside the state capitol that I met Nathan Patel. He was a political science major with sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, organizing students with the efficiency of a seasoned campaign manager. "You're Miguel Reyes," he said, approaching me after I'd given an impromptu speech about water rights. "I've heard about you. The oil heir who chose science over money." Quote, "Former heir," I corrected, but he just smiled. "Even better. You want to change the world? You can't do it alone." That was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape both our lives. Together, we started small, organizing campus cleanups, lobbying for solar panels on university buildings, writing op-eds for the student newspaper. But our real breakthrough came when we co-authored a policy proposal for reducing industrial emissions in residential areas. The proposal caught the attention of local environmental groups and marked the beginning of my journey from activist to advocate. My college years were an endless cycle: study, work, organize, sleep if I was lucky. Some nights I stayed in the library until security kicked me out, my eyes burning from reading about land restoration and policy reform. Some days I survived on ramen noodles because I couldn't afford anything else. But I didn't complain. Every time I thought about Maria Santos and her children, every time I remembered the smell of chemicals in East Austin, I told myself, "You're doing the right thing. You have to keep going." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By my senior year, my name was starting to appear in local newspapers, not as Miguel Reyes, oil heir, but as Miguel Reyes, environmental advocate. I had testified before the Austin City Council about air quality standards, organized protests that drew hundreds of students, and co-founded a nonprofit focused on environmental justice in low-income communities. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something meaningful. That's when my father decided to fight back. It started with a phone call from my mother on a rainy Thursday evening. I was in the lab, analyzing soil samples from a contaminated site near Corpus Christi, when my phone buzzed with her number. We had spoken only a handful of times since I left home, brief conversations filled with careful pleasantries and unspoken longing. "Miguel, mijo," she said, her voice trembling more than usual. "I need to warn you about something. Your father, he's planning to give an interview tomorrow. About environmental regulations. About activists." She paused, and I could hear the weight of her words. "He mentioned your name." Quote, "The next morning I watched from the university library as my father appeared on the local business news program, wearing his trademark navy suit and that cold smile I remembered so well. The interviewer leaned forward as he spoke. "Mr. Reyes, what's your response to the growing environmental movement in Texas?" My father's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "These so-called environmentalists are fantasy peddlers, pure and simple. They'd rather see hard-working Texans lose their jobs than face economic reality. They live in ivory towers, disconnected from the real world. Some critics point to your own son's activism." "I have no son involved in environmental activism," he said, his voice cutting through the studio like ice. "My family understands the importance of economic progress and job creation." I felt like I'd been slapped. Even after all these years, his public rejection still had the power to wound me. But the pain quickly transformed into determination. Within hours, the interview was trending on social media. Javier posted his own response on Twitter, proud to work alongside Dad building Texas's energy future. Some people prefer hashtag activism over hard work. Hashtag resoil, hashtag Texas strong. But something unexpected happened. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters, activists, and policymakers who had been following my work. They wanted my response, my perspective. For the first time, I realized that my father's attempts to diminish me had actually elevated my profile. That evening, I appeared on the same news program. When the interviewer asked about his comments, I looked directly into the camera and spoke from my heart. "I grew up in the oil industry," I said calmly. "I've seen firsthand the cost of putting profit over people. The children in East Austin who can't play outside when the wind blows wrong, the families who can't drink their own well water, they deserve better. This isn't about fantasy. It's about justice. 6 months later, Maria Santos called me with devastating news. The refinery wanted to expand, and despite our previous victory, they were pushing forward with new permits. This time, I knew we needed more than protests. We needed political power. That conversation led to my first real campaign, not just for justice, but for office. State Senator Rebecca Martinez approached me after a packed town hall meeting, where I'd outlined a comprehensive environmental justice platform. "Miguel," she said, her eyes bright with possibility, "have you ever considered running for state senate? The seat for this district is opening up next year. We need someone who understands both policy and people." The campaign was grueling. We operated out of a cramped storefront between a taqueria and a laundromat, surviving on pizza and pure determination. Nathan managed our grassroots operation, while I spent 18-hour days knocking on doors, attending community meetings, and debating my opponent, Marcus Webb, a 3-term incumbent backed by every major corporation in Texas, including Reyes Oil. Election night arrived like a thunderstorm in November. As the numbers rolled in, I stood surrounded by volunteers, watching counties report their results. At 11:47 p.m., the Associated Press called the race. I had won by 6 percentage points. The crowd erupted into celebration, but I felt an unexpected hollowness. After the last volunteer had gone home, I walked alone through downtown Austin. My phone buzzed with hundreds of congratulatory messages, but the ones I wanted most weren't there. No call from my mother. Nothing from my father. The next morning, a small bouquet of bluebonnets appeared on my apartment doorstep with a card that simply read, "Proud of you, Mijo." No signature, but I recognized my mother's handwriting. 2 months later, sitting in my new office in the state capitol, I received the invitation that would change everything: my mother's 60th birthday gala. After 17 years of silence, the Reyes family was ready to see their black sheep again. The Reyes mansion looked exactly as I remembered it, though somehow smaller than the palace of my childhood memories. As my car pulled through the wrought iron gates, I felt 17 again, that scared boy with a suitcase and a scholarship, walking away from everything he'd ever known. But I wasn't that boy anymore. I straightened my shoulders and adjusted my simple black suit. The valet who opened my car door didn't recognize me, which wasn't surprising. The last time I'd walked through these doors, I was 18 and defiant. The foyer buzzed with Austin's elite oil executives, real estate moguls, politicians, and their perfectly polished spouses. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light on faces I remembered from childhood dinner parties, people who'd patted my head and called me Carlos's little prince before I became the family embarrassment. I heard the whisper start immediately. "Is that Miguel Reyes? I thought he was. Didn't he become some kind of activist?" My mother's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "Miguel!" She appeared beside me in an elegant emerald gown, her eyes bright with tears. For a moment, we just stared at each other, 17 years of silence hanging between us. Then she hugged me, right there in front of everyone. It wasn't the polite air-kiss greeting expected at such events. It was a real hug, the kind a mother gives a son she's missed desperately. "You came," she whispered in my ear. "Happy birthday, Mama," I whispered back. "Miguel Reyes," a familiar voice drawled behind me. I turned to find Javier approaching, looking every inch the successful oil executive in his custom tuxedo. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." "Hello, Javier, you look well." "I am well. Very well, actually." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Running the day-to-day operations of Reyes Oil now. Dad's finally ready to let the next generation take the reins." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Of course, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Being too busy playing politician with your tree-hugger friends." Before I could respond, he raised his champagne glass and called out to the room, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my brother Miguel. Some of you might remember him. He used to live here before he decided that hugging trees was more important than family. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in my chest. But then I remembered something Nathan had taught me during the campaign. When they go low, you stay high. Your dignity is your power. I smiled calmly and nodded to the guests, who were now openly staring. Let them look, let them whisper. I had nothing to be ashamed of. From across the room, I noticed an older gentleman watching the exchange with interest. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. His eyes held neither mockery nor pity, just careful observation. The older gentleman I'd noticed earlier began moving through the crowd with purpose. As he approached, I finally recognized him. Judge Thorne Ellison, one of the most respected federal judges in Texas. "Excuse me," Judge Ellison said, his voice carrying the authority that comes from decades on the bench. The conversations around us gradually quieted as people turned to listen. I couldn't help but overhear the introduction, and I believe there's been an oversight. Javier's confident smirk faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, Your Honor." Judge Ellison stepped forward, his steel-gray eyes fixed on me with unmistakable respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to properly introduce Senator Miguel Reyes, the newly elected representative for Texas's 14th Senate District and one of the most promising environmental policy leaders in the country." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as every eye in the room turned to me. Senator. He'd called me Senator. But how did he... I had the privilege of watching Senator Reyes speak at the National Environmental Policy Forum last month, Judge Ellison continued. His proposed legislation on clean air standards is some of the most thoughtful, comprehensive policy work I've seen in 30 years on the federal bench. I found my voice, though it came out softer than intended. "Your Honor, I'm still serving at the state level." "Not anymore," he said with a knowing smile. "The Associated Press called the U.S. Senate race this afternoon. You won by 12 points. Congratulations, Senator Reyes." The room erupted into chaos. Guests pulled out their phones, frantically searching for news coverage. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Javier stood frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, looking like he'd been struck by lightning. But it was my father's face that I'll never forget. Carlos Reyes, the man who'd built an empire through force of will and ruthless determination, looked genuinely shocked for the first time in my life. He stood in the doorway of his study, still as a statue, his usually commanding presence somehow diminished. Judge Ellison raised his own glass. "To Senator Miguel Reyes," he declared, "who proves that true leadership comes not from inheriting power, but from earning it through service to others." "To Senator Reyes," the crowd echoed, though their voices carried a mixture of astonishment, admiration, and in some cases, barely concealed embarrassment. For the first time in my adult life, I was standing in this room not as the disappointing son, not as the family failure, but as someone who commanded respect in his own right. Through the crowd of congratulations and sudden attention, I caught sight of my father. He was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pride, exactly, but something close to recognition, as if he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time. Then he turned and walked back into his study, leaving the door open behind him. An invitation, perhaps. An hour later, I found myself standing outside my father's study, my hand hovering over the mahogany door he'd left open. This room had been the site of our final confrontation 17 years ago. Now it would host another. I knocked gently and stepped inside. My father sat behind his massive oak desk, the same family portrait hanging on the wall, though the young boy in the photograph felt like a stranger now. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, though his posture remained as commanding as ever. "Senator Reyes," he said, not looking up from the papers spread before him, "how does it feel to be the most powerful person in this room?" "I didn't come here for power, Dad. I came for Mom's birthday." He finally raised his eyes to meet mine. "Did you? Or did you come to gloat? To show the old man just how wrong he was about his worthless son?" The words stung, but I'd learned to armor myself against his disappointment. "I came because I hoped maybe, after all these years, you might want to know who your son became." "I know exactly who you became," he said, standing and moving to the window that overlooked the lake. You became someone who thinks he can destroy everything I built. Do you have any idea how your environmental regulations are affecting Reyes Oil? How many jobs you're threatening with your clean energy fantasies? I know exactly how they're affecting the company, I replied calmly, and I know how your operations have been affecting communities like East Austin for decades. Dad, there are children who can't breathe because... Don't lecture me about business, Miguel. The explosion came suddenly, his voice echoing off the walls. I built this empire from nothing. I gave you everything: education, opportunity, a future, and you threw it away to become a bleeding heart politician. The study door slammed open, and Javier burst in, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. This is rich, he sneered. Little Miguel thinks he can waltz back in here and lecture us about our family business. You may have fooled those idiots out there with your Senate title, but we know what you really are, a traitor. Quote, Javier, that's enough, my father warned, but my brother was beyond listening. No, Dad, let's be honest for once. He's been working against us for years. Every regulation he pushes, every policy he promotes, it's all designed to hurt Reyes Oil. He's using his political power to wage a personal vendetta. I felt my carefully maintained composure begin to crack. This isn't about you, Javier. This isn't about the company. This is about doing what's right. Right? He laughed bitterly. Right for who? The people you're putting out of work? The families who depend on the oil industry? You're so concerned with being the hero that you can't see the damage you're causing. Something inside me snapped. 17 years of silence, of swallowing insults, of pretending their rejection didn't matter. It all came rushing to the surface. You want to know about damage? I said, my voice quiet but fierce. I've seen the damage. I've held the hands of mothers whose children have asthma because they live downwind from our refineries. I've tested water that's been poisoned by our drilling operations. I've watched communities suffer while our family counted profits. My father and brother stared at me, perhaps seeing for the first time the steel that adversity had forged in me. I didn't become your enemy, Dad, I continued, looking directly at him. I became everything you taught me to be: strong, principled, and unwilling to compromise my values for money. The only difference is that my values include caring about people other than ourselves. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, my father spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Get out of my house. I nodded, having expected nothing less, but as I reached the door, I turned back one last time. I love you both, I said simply. That's never going to change. But I won't apologize for becoming someone I can be proud of. I walked out of that study knowing it might be the last time I ever spoke to my father. But for the first time in my life, I felt completely free. 6 months later, I stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol as the Texas Clean Energy Initiative passed the Senate with bipartisan support. The bill would create thousands of jobs while reducing emissions by 40% over the next decade. It was the kind of comprehensive legislation I'd dreamed about writing as a college student, surviving on ramen noodles and determination. Nathan stood beside me, grinning as reporters shouted questions about my next policy priorities. How does it feel to be the youngest senator to pass major environmental legislation? One called out. It feels like we're finally keeping our promise to future generations, I replied, thinking of Tati and Gabe, now both in college studying engineering and environmental science respectively. Later that afternoon, I drove to East Austin for my annual Earth Day visit to the elementary school where I'd once taught science classes as a volunteer. The air was cleaner now, thanks to the regulations we'd fought for. Children played outside without the fear that had haunted their parents' generation. Senator Miguel! Gabe called out, running across the playground with his sister close behind. They were both 21 now, brilliant and passionate, carrying forward the torch of justice in their own ways. We saw you on the news, Tati said, hugging me tightly. Mom says you're changing the world just like you promised you would. Maria Santos appeared beside them, older, but still radiating the strength that had inspired my own journey. "Misho," she said, taking my hands in hers, "you remember what I told you when you were 12? That some people are born to make things better?" She smiled, tears in her eyes. "You kept your promise." As I drove back to my modest apartment in D.C. that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. "Would you like to have lunch sometime? I miss our conversations." "Mom!" I pulled over and called the number immediately. My mother answered on the first ring as if she had been waiting. "Miguel?" Her voice was tentative, hopeful. "Yes, Mama, I'd love to have lunch." We met the following week at a quiet cafe near the Capitol. She looked different somehow, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. We talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, filling in the gaps that 17 years had created. "Your father has been different since the gala," she admitted as we shared flan for dessert. "Quieter, more thoughtful. I think seeing you that night, seeing who you've become, it changed something in him." 2 weeks later, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on Reyes oil letterhead, unsigned but in my father's unmistakable script. "I was wrong about many things. Your mother is proud of you. So am I." Quote, I sat in my office overlooking the Capitol Dome, holding that note and thinking about the boy who'd left home with nothing but a dream and a scholarship. He could never have imagined that his path would lead here, not just to political power, but to something more valuable, the knowledge that he'd stayed true to himself even when it cost him everything. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Nathan with news about a potential climate summit I'd been invited to chair. "Are you ready to change the world again, Senator?" he asked with familiar enthusiasm. I looked out at the Capitol, then down at my father's note, then at the photographs on my desk, Maria Santos and her children, my mother at our recent lunch, Judge Ellison from the Environmental Forum, where this all began. "Let's get to work," I said. "We don't choose the families we're born into, but we can choose the legacy we leave behind, and mine was just beginning." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.